So this next childhood memory, I'm just going to read it to you because there was just something that I wrote down in a draft of an email that I wanted to reply to this. I wanted to write this and send it, and I wrote it and I deleted it. I wrote it and I deleted it, and I want to share with you my reaction. So I'm going to just read you the whole thing. Here we go. I grew up in Connecticut, Nevada City, California, and Sonoma and Napa, California. I think life in Sonoma was sort of boring. I remember in elementary school we all decided cocaine was cool. This was the 80s. So we started bringing these plastic bags full of Tang to school and snorting it. Yes, with straws. Crushed breath mints too. Sometimes whole breath mints for added danger. We also, in 6th grade, staged weddings on the playground during lunch. I played the pulpit. And then there was my great love for the Soviet Union. Me and Toby Hokovich realized we had family from Russia and started greeting each other every day with, "Good morning, comrade." Shoplifting started early too. Big trench coats. We filled our pockets with 7-Eleven candy, then took purses from our mother's closets and ransacked drugstores. Probably an ordinary American childhood. So I just have one question for Aurora, who's going to come up in a second. What is Tang? Ladies and gentlemen, Aurora.
All right, 2 things. So this story is it's coming out in maybe a month in Glimmer Train. So I'm very excited to be reading from galleys, which makes me feel like I'm a pirate. And it's a story called Beginning, so there are going to be several beginnings. I'm not senile. The story does start over and over again, so don't be disturbed. And I might sing. Don't be disturbed by that either. It might not be good. The story my mother tells about how I came to be has nothing to do with sex. It takes place years before my birth. My mother believes in the butterfly effect, the idea that the movement of a butterfly's wings can create gale force winds thousands of miles away, that some small thing, a broken shoelace, a falling leaf, can change a person's life. Beginnings are never where we expect to find them. My mother knew my father was her soulmate when they were sitting side by side near a river and a butterfly landed on their knees, half of its body on her knee and half on his. She knew that I was a yogi, a wise child, an old soul, when at 2 years old I broke the ice of a frozen pond with a stick and lay down in the cold water. My parents were hippies. They met in a commune, fell in love, and got married. Listen, my mother says, here's a story. I'm sitting at her kitchen table. She hands me a slice of apple pie. The apples aren't cooked. There's this man, an electrician, she says. One day he's at work on a house, climbing a ladder, and he stops to watch a leaf fall. It brushes past him, twirling, lands in a bird bath below, and he goes on climbing. But somehow when he stops, his shoelace catches in the ladder, and his right foot is stuck. He yanks his foot, and the shoelace breaks, the ladder shakes. His heart starts beating like crazy, and he climbs down and asks the man of the house if he can borrow a shoelace. The man invites him in for a beer and tells him he's got this sick dog, won't eat anything. The electrician takes one look at the dog, and he's in love. He can't explain it. It's a glum-looking boxer with old man eyebrows. He convinces the man to let him take the dog home with him, fix him up. Within a week, the dog's better. One day, the electrician takes it on a walk around his neighborhood, and the dog bolts. He chases it into the backyard of a nice house, and there's a woman there screaming, batting at the animal with one of these nets used to clean a pool. She's cursing in Portuguese. The electrician's from Brazil. He calms her down, catches the dog, and 6 months later, he and the woman are married. None of it wouldn't have happened without that little leaf, my mother says. Okay, then why don't you tell the story of how the leaf fell from the tree, I ask, or how the tree grew, or the history of maple trees in that part of Pennsylvania. I didn't say it was Pennsylvania, my mother says. It's arbitrary, I say. There's no definite cause. Don't be so serious, my mother says. It's karma. The story of how I came to be starts like this. My mother's in the back seat of my grandfather's car, and my grandparents are in the front. She's 19 years old, and they're driving her home from a mental hospital. She'd been taken to the mental hospital because she'd had a bad trip, marijuana laced with mescaline. She'd had a bad trip at the movies with my dad. It seems important, this background detail, but my mother always starts the car in the car, her father driving, her mother in the passenger seat fiddling with the radio. The mental hospital, she says? Oh, it was nice. I should explain that a mental hospital isn't really a big deal in my family. My mother basically grew up in one, a private facility for the wealthy and mad and a few old ladies who didn't want to leave. My grandfather was a psychiatrist there and so enthusiastic about his place of employment that he sent his children, nieces, nephews, even his own parents, to cure them of their woes. It made for great PR. My own son is a patient here, he'd announce to the skeptical newly admitted, to potential funders on a tour, and my uncle would wave and smile in his hospital-issue pajamas. My mother went to Hopefield for the first time when she was in the 3rd grade. She was being picked on by a boy in her class, and every day she cried, begging her parents to let her stay home from school. Instead, she went to the children's ward for a week, where she learned to bake cookies and play chess and talk about her feelings. On the 3rd day, she was bored. There was a boy there, 5 years old, who would not wear clothes. The staff had put a high-collared shirt on him and buttoned it up the back, and he couldn't figure out how to get it off. He spent hours naked from the waist down, sitting in a corner, wriggling and scratching and kicking anyone who tried to get near him. My mother decided to rescue him. She snuck into his room while he was sleeping, pulled off the shirt, and the two of them ran away together. My grandfather found them in the playhouse in the backyard, the little boy naked, asleep, in a blanket my mother had stolen. My mother watching over him, a finger to her lips when her father started to shout. The late-night nurses were surprised to see one of their doctors in his pajamas and overcoat carrying 2 crying children into their ward. "Escapees," he said, laughing. He tucked my mother into bed and tickled her back. "Be patient, Dina," he said. "You might learn something." This is the second beginning. My mother was in the car, and my grandfather was driving. My grandma in the passenger seat fiddling with the radio, putting on fresh lipstick. My mom had been in the hospital a long time. She said her parents were trying to hide her away until the 60s were over and Lil Carter was in office. My grandparents were big on Jimmy Carter. "Now there's a good man," my grandpa used to say, pointing at the picture taped to the fridge. "A reasonable man." My mother was in the hospital for 2 months. My dad had called my grandparents after chasing her out of the movie theater and across the university campus and dragging her back to the house where they lived. They'd been watching a documentary about traveling Bible salesmen, and my dad had fallen asleep. He woke to my mother screaming, waving her hands in front of her face. He was in a daze. He was high. He watched her run out of the theater. He swears the pot wasn't laced with anything. My grandfather came and drove my mother to the hospital, but he couldn't take her to his hospital, not while she was on drugs. It wouldn't look good. He brought her to a county ER, and she spent a week in a locked psych ward seeing tropical birds flying from the ceiling vents, and a tall man who looked like Jesus wandering the halls, standing in every doorway, looking in on the patients, glowing in his white robes, arms held out at his sides in a gesture of love, his wrists covered in spidery black stitches. She was transferred to Hopefield when the hallucinations stopped, spent 6 weeks there, and her parents drove her home. Her mother settled on a rock and roll station, and her father drummed his fingers against the steering wheel to "Hello, I Love You" by the Doors. When they parked in front of the house, her mother turned around and smiled, lipstick staining her front teeth. "What?" my mom said. My grandmother's cheeks were flushed. "Ma, what?" It was spring break, and all the eligible Jewish boys in the neighborhood were home from college. My mother opened the door to the sound of the piano playing, and her 3rd-grade bully, the one who sent her to the mental hospital in the first place, fat Walter Kaplan, grown tall and muscular, laughing and playing Love Me Do, her friend Sherry sitting on the plastic-covered couch singing along. "Surprise!" her mother sang. "Welcome home from the loony bin," Sherry said, patting the couch next to her. "I brought you a treat." She nodded at Walter, who kept singing at top volume. "He's minoring in music," Sherry said. "Harvard," she whispered. "Don't you know anything new?" my mother asked him. Walter stopped playing and turned to her, grinning. "You're a singer," he said. "I saw you in Fiddler." He grabbed the dust cloth from the piano top and threw it over his head like a shawl. "Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match." My mother laughed. She thought, what a square. She thought my dad would probably call him something worse, a plebe, a cog, an automaton. My dad was reading Marx that year. He was a philosopher. But that wasn't why she liked him. She liked him because he was cute. He was blonde and blue-eyed, tall and skinny, in ripped corduroy pants and lumberjack shirts he got at a thrift store in Maine. He played guitar and sang her to sleep with a voice like James Taylor. He'd had a hard life, a life she couldn't imagine. She heard he was dating someone else now. Walter stopped singing. "Do you remember me?" he asked. "You moved away when we were kids," my mother said. "Boston," he said, "but I came to see you sing. You got talent," he said. "You came to see me?" He turned back to the piano. "I don't know anything new," he said. And then he played a few notes from West Side Story. It was my mother's favorite, "When You're a Jet." Next to her, Sherry started singing in her off-key nasal voice, and my mom joined in. She could feel her mother gloating in the kitchen, about to pick up the phone and call her sister to tell her about the Kaplan boy. They went through the whole show laughing and talking in between about college and the shows they'd seen on Broadway, and when they got to somewhere, her parents came in with their hats and coats on. "We're going grocery shopping," her mother said. "Both of you?" "We want to get out of your hair," her father said. My mom's hair was cut short that year, and she ran her hand through it to tease him. Everyone laughed a little too loud at the joke. They were all trying to act normal, but the truth was, she had gone a little crazy this time. She heard her father in the hospital calling it a schizophrenic break. She thought of synonyms: crazy vacation, hallucinatory timeout. She'd heard another doctor say to her father, "Marijuana isn't that kind of drug, Alan." She'd hallucinated for a week, even after they gave her something to shut her brain up. But maybe it was the second drug that made her crazy, or maybe it was college, or maybe it was that movie, those sad men endlessly knocking on the doors of sad houses. Or maybe it was my dad, Daniel. Maybe he'd given her something else. He liked to do acid. She'd only known him for a couple of months. Who knew what people were like? She looked at Walter talking to Sherry. He had a sculpted, theatrical sort of face, a nice jaw and thick lips. He licked them as she thought this, and my mother laughed. "What was it like?" he asked her. "Going crazy," my mother said. "Yeah," he said, "drugs, the whole thing." "Yeah," he said, "drugs, the whole thing." "You don't smoke grass," my mother said. Sherry smacked her arm. "Don't show off." "I smoke a little," Walter said. "I heard God," my mother said. "God?" Sherry moved away from her on the couch. "How'd you know it was God?" My mother opened her mouth. She was improvising now. They were religious, both of them. "The voice of God," she said. Why was she lying to these nice people? She wondered. Sherry still had the same hairdo she'd had in high school, shoulder length with bangs and a headband. What could she tell them? That their lives were a dream, a capitalist contrived bubble that will burst, that everything they had was made by war and suffering, that it would go on, people having babies and trying to feed them, Bible salesmen coming to their doors, all of it empty, birth and death and bills and babies, all of it the same. She never should have seen that movie. She shouldn't have read Marx. Walter turned back to the piano. The doorbell rang. Sherry was still staring at her, waiting to hear about God. My mother wasn't sure about God. Jesus tried to commit suicide. She didn't want to tell them that. "You want me to get that?" Walter said. He got up to answer it. "It's for you," he said. Goes on, I'm going to stop there.